Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Israel Unplugged. This is Josh Wander from Yerushalayim, Yira Kodesh. I'm here with my co-host, Rabbi Moshe Lichtman from Beit Shemesh.
Shalom, shalom. Thank you for joining us today.
Israel Unplugged is where you get the unadulterated facts of where we're holding in the redemptive process, focusing primarily on the ingathering of the exiles. We are a live show, so therefore you are you are encouraged to phone in and ask your questions and give your comments. If you're in North America, the number is 301-768-4841. And if you're in Israel, the number is 02-650-0151. We encourage you to call in. Now, this week, we're going to be speaking, it's Parshat Chayei. We're going to be speaking about what this parsha means. You know, the parshot that we've had here throughout Bereshit, throughout the whole Torah, of course, but especially these ones that we've been through, Lech Lecha and Ve'era and Chayei. These are definitely parshot that revolve around Eretz Yisrael and the acquiring of Eretz Yisrael. In this case, it's the death of Sarah Imenu and Avraham Avinu purchasing a plot, a burial place for his late wife in Hebron. Hebron has a special history to it, both an ancient history and a modern history. And part of that history has to do with some happy things and some sad things. One of the sad things was a terrible terror attack that occurred in 1980, in which 6 beautiful people were taken from us by these terrible Arab terrorists in Hebron. And one of those was named Tzvi Glatt. And Tzvi Glatt wrote a book, or actually wrote a bunch of notes that were compiled into a book. And that book was translated by Rabbi Lichtman. It is known as Rise from the Dust, or Me'afar Kumi. We're also going to have a special guest, someone who was a close and dear friend of Tzvi Glatt. And we're looking forward to coming back with you soon and discussing all these wonderful things. So stay by and don't leave, because this is where you want to be. Eretz Yisrael is where you want to be, and this show.
So, okay, we will see you soon.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Israel Unplugged. For people who are just tuning in right now, we are going to be discussing a book that was written by Rabbi Lichtman, was translated by Rabbi Lichtman, called Rise from the Dust. It's a book written by a boy, a single boy named Tzvi Glatt, who was murdered in 1980 in a terrorist attack in Hebron. And Tzvi Glatt was born in 1959 in the United States, and he immigrated to Israel in 1975. He studied at the Or Etzion B'nai Akiva Yeshiva from 76 to 77, and 1 year later he came to Jerusalem to study at the Yeshiva Merkaz Harav Kook. On Friday night, May 2nd, 1980, he was gunned down by Arab murderers near Beit Hadassah in Hebron. He was just 21 years old. Fortunate for us, Tzvi left behind this small but monumental work on the importance of settling the land of Israel, especially in our times. His goal was to awaken diaspora Jews from their slumber and rekindle within them the ancient love for the desirable land. Now, for the first time, 30 years after his tragic death, this book is available to the English-speaking public, the very people whom Tzvi intended it for. We only hope that Jews the world over will study its words and take its lessons to heart. May this book serve as an everlasting memorial for this potential Gadol B'Torah whose life was cut short by those who wish to destroy us. And with that, I will allow Rabbi Moshe Lichtman, the translator of the book, to continue.
Yes. So, it's really amazing when you consider, when you read the book and you see the amount of sources and the depth of the understanding of the sources that this young 20-year-old boy, that's really what we call him, a 20-year-old boy, had already at such a young age, that he could write a book which to this day is one of the classics in religious Zionist thought. And it's not only, a nice fluffy book where he talks about, some nice reasons why a Jew should live in Israel. The first half is more hashkafic, which we'll get to. I'll explain what exactly he does there. But the second half of the book, and actually even the greater portion of the book, is a halachic discourse on the mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. And it's a very, very complicated sugya discussion in halachic sources, whether or not it is a mitzvah nowadays to live in the land of Israel. Nowadays, I mean, after we were exiled from the land, do we still have a mitzvah, an obligation to pick up and live in Israel if it's possible? Right. Obviously, during the time when it's when the land is desolate and there's no way to actually make a living or survive there, of course, it's not a mitzvah. But or of course, you don't have to fulfill the mitzvah. Let's put it that way. So he has a whole discussion about it. And he was only 20 years old. I always say, and I'm very glad that we're going to have the opportunity very shortly to talk to one of Tzvi's very good friends, Rabbi Arishwat. And he'll tell us the truth about this. What kind of a mind and soul Tzvi Glatt had, because he really knew him personally. But I always say that just from reading this book, it is clear that this young man would have been a very, very important rabbi in our world. I don't want to say that he would be one of the Gedolei Hador, one of the great, halachic deciders of halacha in the world, but he certainly would have been a very important rabbi in our world. I want to read from you from one of the testimonials that were written and are printed in the book. This one is from Rav Shaul Yisraeli. Those of you who don't know, Rav Shaul Yisraeli, Zichrono Livracha, was a Rosh Yeshiva of Merkaz Harav, and he was also one of the Dayanim, one of the judges on the Supreme Rabbinic Court in Jerusalem. He was a very, very important rabbinic figure. He was one of the Gedolei Hador. So he writes this amazing little piece about Tzvi Glatt to be printed in the book, which it was. And one of the parts he writes as follows: he came to us from afar, from the United States, which, by the way, is the most amazing thing about it. It's not like he was born Israeli and he knew the language. He came as an American kid. He made Aliyah at the age of 16. Think about that. In the middle of high school, he was so driven to make Aliyah. He didn't want to wait for another year, another 2 years till he went to Israel for the year, so to say, right? He did it in the middle of his high school, against his parents' wishes, which is a discussion in of itself whether that was correct or not. His parents, by the way, were totally devastated by his death. Supposedly, from what I understand from the family, they never really recovered from it. It was a very terrible thing. Obviously, when someone's going to make Aliyah against their parents' wishes, they don't know that they're going to be killed in a terrorist attack. But anyway, so Rav Yisraeli writes as follows: he came to us from afar, from the United States, the land of prosperity, the flourishing and tranquil diaspora, the self-confident exile that is proud of the exemplary democracy that exists in the country in which it dwells, which is very funny. A few days after the recent elections. Anyway, the Jew enjoys unlimited freedom there. He feels no need to hide his identity, and sees himself as an equal to all the other citizens, both in terms of obligations and privileges. Even after Tzvi set his sights on Torah, he could have found satisfaction in one of the magnificent yeshivot there, Lakewood, Baltimore, Yeshiva University, etc. And subsequently, he could have taken his place among the ranks of the young rabbis who operate successfully within their communities and clear their conscience with respect to Eretz Yisrael and the state of Israel by donating to the cause in the form of an enthusiastic speech at a fundraising dinner for our brethren struggling for the right to occupy this land, or in the form of a quick visit to Israel in order to admire the bustling life in its settlements despite the daily hardships. That's what Tzvi could have done. Yet, he could have, but he chose a different path. He saw his future in the land of Israel, learning Torah in its unique atmosphere and becoming one of its sons/builders. Moreover, he could not understand the apathy of the religious community in Chutz La'aretz, in the diaspora, and their failure to answer the call of the hour, to ascend to Eretz Yisrael and take hold of it. How can it be that at such a time, when the gates of the land are open wide, Jews choose to remain in the diaspora and view it as their home for years to come? How can they ignore the mitzvah of dwelling in Eretz Yisrael, one of the most important mitzvot upon which the entire Torah hangs? He, Tzvi, dedicated his studies to elucidating this mitzvah down to its details, culling from earlier and later sources, meaning Rishonim and Achronim. He recorded whatever he discovered with the intention of showing it to the religious Jews of America. His whole point was this book should be for the religious Jews, for the Torah Jews in America, and show them, prove to them that they have to come on Aliyah, especially among Torah scholars, in order to convince them to abandon their plans in Chutz La'aretz and come and settle in the Holy Land. Had death not descended upon him suddenly, he certainly would have continued to perfect the fruits of his research and publish a wonderful collection of laws. And then he goes on, but the point is, what happened was he left a manuscript, which was not 100% complete, but it was mostly complete. It was, I would even say, well over 90% complete. It wasn't just a bunch of, disparate notes. He had already more or less finished the book. And his friends, after he was murdered, his friends, you see, you have to understand, his friends, this was this American kid, I'm talking about his Israeli friends in Merkaz Arav, they always saw him, this American kid, just sitting and, learning day and night as much as he could. And they were very impressed by it, but they never knew what he was doing. And then after he was killed, they went through his possessions, his stuff, and they saw this 20-year-old American kid wrote a book that is fitting to be one of the classics. And they put it together and they printed it. And for many, many years, it was out there in Hebrew. By the way, it's, I think, totally unavailable in Hebrew anymore. And it really should be reprinted with a lot of corrections, by the way. The original Hebrew had a lot of mistakes. And then I had the fortune of translating it a few years ago. So anyway, this is who Tzvi Glatt was. And, again, we decided to discuss it today because he was killed in Hebron. They had gone to Ma'arat HaMachpelah. This was in the very beginning of the return to Hebron, the famous, the women who were allowed to stay in Beit Hadassah. So people would come for Shabbatot to help raise their spirits. And he came with a bunch of friends to Hebron. They had a beautiful, uplifting Friday night davening, prayer at the cave, and on their way back, they were gunned down by Arab terrorists. By the way, very sadly, one of those terrorists is currently the Arab mayor of Hebron. Could you believe it? He was
actually not only that, but the other ones were let go during a prisoner exchange. So they're
Right.
all released.
They're all free.
Yeah, and one of them is the mayor of Hebron. It's a horrible thing.
Horrible.
And we're going to be speaking to one of his good friends in the next segment. So stay tuned and
Stay with us.
make sure you hear this because he's a very special guest.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with Love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with Love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to the second segment of Israel Unplugged. As promised, we have a very, very special guest that's going to be coming on very shortly. And he is a close friend. He was a close friend of Tzvi Glatt, the person that we're speaking about, that this book was written by. And I just wanted to introduce Rabbi Schwartz. Rabbi Arishwat lectures regularly at many yeshivas, seminaries, colleges, and adult education groups. He's the director of Rav Kook's archives, and he has published over 200 articles as well as several volumes on the previously unpublished writings of Rav Kook, Jewish family life, and religious Zionism, including the Israeli flag and Hebrew language in Jerusalem. He also replies regularly to halachic and philosophic questions in English on the Yeshivat Beit El website. He was raised in Riverdale, and he did the Hesder program at the Or Etzion and Kiryat Arba Yeshivot, where he received smicha and served as a sergeant in Tzahal. He holds a bachelor's in Tanakh from Michlelet Herzog in Gush Etzion and an MA in Jewish history and Talmud. He enjoys utilizing his music as an educational medium and has produced 2 albums of original compositions. Rav Ari is a popular international lecturer, and he has addressed hundreds of communities in Israel and abroad as scholar in residence, and representing the Jewish agency OU, B'nai Akiva, Mizrahi, Rabbeinu Tzahar, and other religious and Zionist organizations. In the U.S., New York, Baltimore, Washington, Miami, and Boston, in Canada, Russia, France, England, and Switzerland, he lives in Kochav HaShachar with his wife, Tzivia, and their 7 children.
Wow. Okay. I'm looking forward to hearing him. He's going to be on in a very short time. Until he comes on, though, let's continue talking a little bit about the book that we're talking about, Rise from the Dust. So in another testimonial that was written by also a close friend, he was also a famous rabbi, Rav Uzi Kalchaim, who also unfortunately is not with us anymore. He wrote as follows: by writing this work, Tzvi wanted to awaken in our hearts the ancient love for the desirable land. He wrote from the depths of his pure soul, which felt the pain of his nation, crying out and demanding restoration and perfection. This is evident from Tzvi's harsh and at times even irate style. You know, this is one thing I say, you know, when the older you get, the more, you know, what is it called? You get a little bit tactful, okay? Or, yeah, you know, a little bit more calm down. You know, when you're young, you're so gung-ho. You have a certain, you know, issue that you want to tell the world, you want to change the world. You don't yet know how to, you know, rein yourself in a little bit, to make yourself politically correct a little bit to a certain degree. Tzvi was only 20 years old. And, to a certain degree, that's why the book is so special. The purpose is to shock the reader and make it impossible for him to remain complacent and indifferent. This allows the author's words to become engraved in and fill the reader's hearts until he rouses himself to do whatever he can in accordance with his strengths and capabilities. So, again, until Rav Schwartz is with us, he was just in the middle of classes, and we have a very small window of opportunity to speak to him. So we're trying right now to get in touch with him. He will be on with us in very shortly. But until then, let me describe a little bit how the first part, at least, of the book goes. It's again.
I just wanted to mention.
Yeah.
That's you mentioned already that he's 20 years old. He's a young boy, and he has in his book he has letters that were written from some of the greatest rabbis of the generation, which include Rav Avad Yosef and Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Avram Shapira. These are amazing. Even people that are much wiser and much older often do not get these kind of letters in their books, and these are amazing thing for a 20 odd person to be able to get in his book. We have Rabbi Schwartz on the line, but he needs one more minute. So do you want to start, Rav Moshe? Or do you want to wait?
Yeah, I think we'll wait.
Maybe we want to read one of the Askamas that I can read from Rav Moshe Feinstein.
Well, the Moshe Feinstein, we have to give a little bit of a background.
Okay.
That one you shouldn't. But maybe just read a little quote from the back of the book. We can read a little quote from Rav Avad Yosef. Rav Avad Yosef, we all know who Rav Avad Yosef was. He says, I went through its parts, the book, and saw... okay, so now Rav Schwartz is with us, and we are able to speak to him. Shalom, Rav Schwartz.
Shalom Aleichem.
Okay,
I don't hear you too well. Maybe I'll try putting on headphones. Or can you raise your volume?
Yes.
It's a known problem.
Yeah, but Tamar, you're going to try to help us out here. And we're going to speak as loud as we can, okay?
Okay, but let me put in my headphones. Just so that way
great.
I'll be able to hear you that much more. Much better.
Okay. All right. We're just waiting 1 second. Please have patience with us.
Okay.
Well worth it. Well worth it to wait.
Well worth it. Okay, great. All right, you with us? You have the earphones in yet?
Rabbi Schwartz.
I guess not. Just give him a second. Let's give him a second.
The ear. Yeah, got it.
Okay, great. So let me start by asking you as follows. One of the things I always say when I talk about this book and about Tzvi, I personally didn't know him, but I say just from reading the book that had he still been alive, there's no doubt that he would have been a very, very chashuv, very important rabbi in our days. Can you please tell us what you think about that, and in general, tell us, what you know, how you met him, what your relationship was with him.
Okay. First of all, I agree with you 100%. Tzvi was, you could tell from his sefer that if a 21-year-old wrote a book with such bikiyut and understanding already at the age of 21, he definitely had a great future ahead of him. The truth is, Tzvi was good friends with my older brother, Morty, who's 2 years older than I. When I joined Bnei Akiva in 10th grade, he already was a legend in that he grew up in Flatbush. He was a madrich in the branch of Bnei Akiva there, Snif Etzion. And he went to high school at BTA. That's the Brooklyn version of MTA. It doesn't exist anymore.
Correct.
And he had a very influential madrich named Rabbi Natan Greenberg. Today he lives he's a Rosh Yeshiva in Bat Ayin. He became a Breslover Chassid. And he was... if my information is correct, he was the first American to do Hesder, to do a full 5-year Hesder program in Yeshivat Har Etzion in the Gush, this Natan Greenberg. And he used to go back in the summers to be a madrich in Bnei Akiva. And Tzvi, he was called Howie at the time, Tzvi Glatt was a very idealistic young man. And he asked, at what time, at what age does this mitzvah apply? To which his madrich answered, just like all the mitzvot, it starts at the age of 13. So Tzvi said, so why don't we make aliyah? And even though it's not very practical for a 16-year-old to make aliyah, he came in contact that summer of Chaim Druckmann, was the Rav at the Bnei Akiva National Seminar for 11th graders. And it's right nearby the Camp Moshev Indian Orchard. And Tzvi heard that Rav Druckmann had a yeshiva high school. And even though his parents weren't so keen on the idea, he spoke with Rav Druckmann if he would accept him to his high school. And even if his parents weren't willing to pay tuition. And Rav Druckmann said, how can I not help somebody who wants to make aliyah? Wow. And then Tzvi, then and there, at the age of 16, decided that he wanted to learn Hebrew. And that summer, after 10th grade, he went to, all this was after 9th grade. And then, 10th grade, sorry. And then he decided that he had to learn Hebrew. He had to perfect his Hebrew. So he went to Kibbutz Shluchot, where there was a shliach named Simcha Lufsky. He was a Bnei Akiva shliach. And he said, you could spend the summer by us, the rest of the summer by us. And then he finished high school, finished 11th and 12th grades in Yeshivat Or Etzion. Then Rav Druckmann decided it was a very strong shevet, a very strong year. And Rav Shimon Lapid, for example, one of the top Ramim in Or Etzion, he was in that year. And they decided that they wanted to start a yeshiva gvoa, a Hesder yeshiva.
Rabbi Schwartz, we're going to be finishing this segment. Can you stay with us on the next segment?
Yeah, sure.
We have some commercials, and we'll come right back.
Okay, no problem.
All right, thank you.
Okay, we'll continue the story. Please stay with us, and we'll be right back with you.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Ben-Tekoa, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
Welcome back to Israel Unplugged. This is the third and final segment of the show. We were discussing the book Rise from the Dust, which is a translation of a book written by Tzvi Glatt, Hashem Yikom Damo, who was murdered in Hebron. And we have a friend of his on the line to discuss it, Rabbi Arishwat. He's in the middle of a story. Please continue, Rabbi Schwartz.
Okay, so the main thing, like I said, Tzvi was a legend during his life that he just left his home, his family, his school. At the age of 16, he left his comfortable surroundings in Flatbush and became a chalut, became a pioneer, coming alone to the land of Israel. He, as a matter of fact, accepted upon himself already on the airplane on the way to Israel that from then on he will only speak in Hebrew. And that's how I knew him. We only spoke Hebrew. By the way, he had a very thick Brooklyn accent, so you couldn't miss that it wasn't his mother tongue. But as a matter of ideology, he always spoke the holy language, Ivrit. Tzvi was an extraordinary person. First of all, he was tall, about 6'2". He was an outstanding basketball player, and also an accomplished guitarist, and also very intelligent and idealistic. And like I said, he finished high school, got the Israeli Bagrut, did the Israeli matriculation in 11th and 12th grades in a foreign language. And then he was in the first year of studying in Yeshivat Or Etzion when they started the Hesder Yeshiva there. That was a program where they merge the service in the Israeli army and learning Torah in Yeshiva. And then the next year, in Tafshin Lametet, 1979, he decided that he wanted to learn in Merkaz Harav, which is very unique, because I know when I wanted to learn in Merkaz Harav, everyone told me the same thing, that if you don't have family in Israel, it's too big, and you'll just get lost. But Tzvi already considered himself an Israeli, and he went to learn in Merkaz Harav, and very quickly, even though he was only in his first year there, everybody knew that here was an exceptional person. He used to walk around with a pocket notebook. Whenever he saw a source about the importance of living in the land of Israel, he would write down the source. He would take it out of his pocket, write down the source, and little by little, even though he was just in Shana Bet in the yeshiva, he was putting together a book about the obligation of all of the Jews in the world coming home to Israel. And before we talk about the book, maybe we'll just fill in that he was we're having a Shabbaton, a weekend, for Chevra from Shevet Kisufim. That was his age group in Bnei Akiva. Those were 20 and 21-year-olds who stayed in Israel. Most students from yeshivas, from day schools in America, they come for a year to Israel, a gap year, and they learn in yeshiva. If they're really serious, they'll say a second year. And these were the people, there were about 10 of them, who decided to stay a third year. And really, basically, they stayed in the land of Israel. And they were talking about making a garin to settle in a city, whether Petach Tikva, Tel Aviv, in order to strengthen Torah Judaism, religion, not just in the West Bank, in Yehuda v'Shomron, and Judea and Samaria, but also in the cities. And so they were in Hebron for Shabbat, and my brother was walking with them. My brother was also part of this Shabbaton, part of this weekend. And the women from Hebron had gone into Beit Hadassah. Hadassah Hospital was built in the 1920s, and it served the Jews and the Arabs of Hebron. It was built by the Hadassah Women of America. And then in 1929, when the Arabs killed all of the Jews, or they killed 67 Jews of Hebron, and the rest of the Jews ran away, the building was totally empty. And I was told that the Arabs are very superstitious, and where you kill a person, they were scared that there were ghosts there. So they never really used that building, and it was an empty building until in 1979, a bunch of women and children climbed through a ladder into the second story, and they came And they just said that it's not enough that we're living in Kiryat Arba, which is a new neighborhood, a Jewish neighborhood outside of Hebron. There's no reason why we don't live in the city of our forefathers itself. Just like there's the Rova Yehudi, the Jewish quarter in Yerushalayim, there should also be a Jewish neighborhood in Hebron. And every Friday night in the yeshiva, I also learned in the yeshiva, we would go on Friday night to the women, and in their honor, to admire their bravery, we would sing Eshet Chayil. And I wasn't there that Shabbat. But my brother and Tzvi, they were on their way to sing Eshet Chayil. They were standing right in front of the Hadassah Hospital building. And my brother was telling Tzvi, my brother was a tour guide, that there's a fork in the road, that if you take the right-hand side, that brings you to the Slobodka Yeshiva, which also was in Hebron before 1929. And if you take the left side of the road, of the fork, that takes you to the Beit Kvarot, to the cemetery. And just when he said that sentence, that this road takes you to the cemetery, the first hand grenade of the terrorists was thrown. And a large piece of shrapnel hit Tzvi, and it killed him right away. And my brother was wounded by that same hand grenade. And in the meantime, the Arabs continued throwing hand grenades and shooting. If I remember correctly, there were 3 terrorists, and they were hiding behind the building and shooting from on top of the building. And they were shooting for about 2 minutes, and then they killed 6 boys, 6 yeshiva boys, and wounded about 20. Some of the wounded were other Americans who were there on that Shabbaton, and Tzvi was killed. And the Israeli army immediately sent helicopters to bring the wounded to Yerushalayim, and that was a very significant turning point in the relations between Jews and Arabs in the Yehuda v'Shomron. Because until then, there basically were good relationships. We used to buy our vegetables and fruit in the Arab shuk, and they were very friendly. And this really changed and ruined the relationship between the Arabs and the Jews in Hebron. And after Tzvi was killed, one of his roommates in Merkaz Harav, Rav Beni Elon, Zichrono Livracha, who afterwards was a member of Knesset, he was a minister in Knesset, one of the leaders of Gush Amonim. I
think, Josh, you were his assistant, right?
I was an advisor to the Moledet faction, yes.
Yes, okay, go on, sorry. Yes.
And they decided to publish the book of Me'afar Kumi, which, can I talk a little about Me'afar Kumi?
Yeah, I mean, I did a little bit, but I mean, it was only a few more minutes, so let's try to summarize it quickly.
Okay. So I'll give you a personal slant on it.
Right,
Tzvi went in 79, that same year. He went to America for his sister's wedding, and he figured once he's in America, he'll go to Rav Moshe Feinstein, who is the top posek in America, and really his book is the alternative to Rav Moshe Feinstein's opinion. Tzvi gathered more than 30 Rishonim and Achronim, some of the greatest rabbis, who say that living in the land of Israel is an obligation, and that it's an Aveirah, it's actually a sin to live out, for a Jew to live outside of the land of Israel. And this is the opinion of Rashi, who uses the term Avon Dirat Chutz La'aretz, the sin of living in Chutz La'aretz, the Ravid, the Ran, the Vilna Gaon, Noda B'Yehuda, Chatam Sofer, Yavitz, Chazon Ish. Really, you could say the top poskim of the last 500 years, almost all of them use the term, there's an obligation to live in the land of Israel. Rav Ovadia Yosef went so far as to say, he said, look at all of the questions asked in the Gemara, where the Gemara says that one of the few cases that a woman can divorce her husband, can instigate a divorce of her husband, is if he doesn't want to make aliyah. Rav Ovadia Yosef said, if it's an optional mitzvah, why don't you just keep them together? Why ruin shalom bayit? Why break up the family Okay, if it's optional mitzvah, so you can opt not to do the mitzvah. Rabbi Yosef said the same thing regarding Shabbat, that you're allowed, it's a mitzvah to buy a house in Israel on Shabbat. And again, if it's an optional mitzvah, so don't buy it on Shabbat. If you can only buy it on the Sabbath, so don't do it.
Okay,
so we
Rabbi
see
Schwartz,
again,
I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut you off, but I want to say one thing that really impressed me. I always wondered, from reading the book and reading the explanations of all the people before, why he wrote the book, it was all for diaspora Jewry, and I didn't understand then why didn't he write it in English since he knew English. But you just answered that question before by saying he accepted upon himself only to speak in Hebrew, and therefore I was given the zechut, the merit to translate it, albeit 30 years later. But finally, the book is in English, and anybody who wants to can go on my website, toratzion.com, and order the book and any of my other books. We want to thank Rav Schwartz, and maybe, you have so much more to say. Maybe we'll have you on.
We'd love to have him on again.
Yes, 100%. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Pleasure. I just wanted to add that usually when people read a book, they skip over the introduction. I think the most...
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.